At my father's lavish retirement gala, he raised his crystal champagne flute to a room of 200 elite guests and declared that only the children who made him proud were truly his. The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Then his cold eyes locked onto me, sitting in the darkest corner of the room. He told me I was a mediocre embarrassment who had brought a struggling nobody into his family, and he ordered me to leave. I stood up slowly, refusing to shed a single tear. But before I could turn away, my husband stood up beside me. What he did next left the entire room gasping for air. 3 hours before my father stood on that stage and tried to cast me out of the family, the evening had begun with the slow, toxic drip of cocktail hour. The grand foyer of the country club was bathed in the warm golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. A string quartet played a classical rendition of a popular rhythm and blues song in the corner. Waiters in tailored white jackets moved smoothly through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with caviar, seared scallops, and flutes of imported champagne. The room was packed with the most influential people in Atlanta. There were neurosurgeons, real estate tycoons, and corporate executives everywhere you looked. Julian and I had just checked our coats and stepped into the foyer. I was wearing a custom emerald silk gown. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design tailored perfectly to my frame, completely unbranded but worth more than most of the cars parked in the valet lot outside. I wore my natural hair in a beautiful, intricate updo. I felt confident. I felt prepared. But the moment we crossed the threshold, the suffocating reality of my family hit me like a physical weight. We did not even have to look for my mother. We could hear her. Valerie was holding court near a towering, intricately carved ice sculpture in the center of the room. She was surrounded by a circle of elite socialites, women she had spent decades trying to impress. She held a glass of champagne in one hand, her diamond rings catching the light as she aggressively gestured and dominated the conversation. "My Chloe is absolutely revolutionizing the beauty industry," my mother boasted, her voice carrying easily over the soft music. "Her luxury hair care line is expanding into Europe next quarter. The profit margins are simply staggering. She is a visionary. She inherited her father's brilliant mind for commerce." I stood a few feet away, listening to the sheer volume of her lies. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but my mind immediately pulled up the financial ledgers I had meticulously audited just 3 nights ago. Chloe was not a visionary. Her luxury haircare business was an absolute financial disaster. They had exactly $0 in accounts receivable. They had not paid their overseas manufacturers in 8 months, and their distribution centers were completely empty. The European expansion my mother was loudly bragging about was actually a desperate attempt to dodge domestic creditors and file for international bankruptcy protection. The only reason Chloe was not facing massive civil lawsuits right this second was because of the stolen money my father had been quietly funneling into her failing accounts to keep up appearances. But my mother was not finished painting her masterpiece of a family. And Jamal, she continued, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "Well, you all know Jamal. Calvin is officially stepping down tonight, and Jamal is being fast-tracked to senior vice president. He has closed so many major accounts this year. My boys are going to run the entire logistics industry before he even turns 40. Another blatant, fabricated lie. As a forensic accountant, I knew the truth about my brother's legendary business acumen. Jamal had spent the last 3 quarters losing 2 of the largest shipping contracts the logistics firm had ever held because he was too busy playing golf on the corporate account. He was lazy, arrogant, and entirely dependent on my father to clean up his massive professional failures. I felt Julian step up close behind me. His warm hand rested reassuringly on the small of my back. He leaned down, his lips brushing softly against my ear. "Do you think she actually believes the garbage she is saying?" Julian whispered, his tone laced with dark amusement. "Or is she just that desperate to convince everyone else?" "She believes whatever keeps her in the spotlight," I whispered back, keeping my eyes fixed on my mother's beaming face. Just then the crowd shifted. Valerie turned her head and spotted me standing near the entrance. The bright, performative smile instantly vanished from her face. It was replaced by a tight, strained grimace that told me exactly how much my presence disgusted her. She quickly excused herself from her circle of admirers, citing a minor family matter, and marched briskly toward Julian and me. Her eyes scanned me up and down with intense, unfiltered disapproval. "Maya, what on earth were you thinking with your hair?" my mother hissed the moment she was close enough. "It is a retirement gala, not a poetry slam. You could not find the time to get a proper silk press. You know the mayor is here tonight." I took a slow, deep breath. I loved my natural hair, and I knew it looked elegant. But explaining that to a woman who had spent her entire life trying to assimilate into wealthy white corporate culture was a waste of breath. Before I could answer, her gaze dropped to my emerald gown. She let out a heavy, disappointed sigh. "And that dress," Valerie continued, shaking her head. "It is very sweet, very economical. But you are standing in a room full of Chanel and Dior, Maya. You look like you bought that off a clearance rack at a department store. You look like you belong in the catering kitchen. I have told you 1,000 times, if you cannot afford to dress like an executive's daughter, you should just ask me for a loan. You are embarrassing us." The words were designed to shrink me. They were the exact same insults she had been hurling at me since I was a teenager. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to look down at my shoes, apologize for my existence, and scurry away to the darkest corner of the room. She thrived on reducing me to the role of the quiet, unremarkable middle child, the one she kept hidden in the closet while she paraded my golden siblings around the country club. I bit my tongue. I swallowed the sharp, biting response that was sitting right on the edge of my lips. I played the part. I looked down and offered a polite, muted apology. Julian did not explode. He did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply exerted his quiet, terrifying power. He gently squeezed my hand, his thumb rubbing smooth, comforting circles against my skin. It was a silent communication between us, a reminder of the absolute empire we were secretly building together. We knew what was hidden in the classified black folder waiting in our car. We knew that Julian's private equity firm owned the very building my mother was standing in. Julian smiled at my mother. It was a polite, devastatingly handsome smile. "I think my wife looks absolutely breathtaking tonight, Valerie," he said, his voice smooth and incredibly calm. "Emerald has always been her color. It suits a woman who knows her true worth." My mother sneered at him, her eyes narrowing as she took in his tailored but understated suit. "Of course you would think that, Julian," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "When you spend your days sitting in a cramped cubicle making a low-level salary, you do not know the cost of true luxury. To someone like you, anything shiny looks expensive. Try not to embarrass Calvin tonight. He has real investors here." She gave a dismissive huff, turned on her designer heel, and marched back toward the ice sculpture to rejoin her wealthy friends. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension settling tight across my shoulders. Julian pulled me slightly closer, kissing the side of my head. "Let her have her fun," he murmured gently. "The night is still very young." I nodded, letting his steady confidence anchor me. I thought the worst of the pre-dinner greetings was over, but the peace did not last for more than a minute. Through the shifting crowd of socialites and executives, I saw a familiar, imposing figure stumbling heavily in our direction. It was my older brother, Jamal. He was already holding a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch, swaying slightly on his feet as he navigated the marble floor. His eyes were bloodshot and his face was flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire city. Attached tightly to his arm was his wife, Sarah. Sarah came from generational old money. She wore a sparkling couture gown and a heavy diamond tennis bracelet that caught the light with every movement. She looked at me with that trademark expression of profound pity and subtle disgust she reserved exclusively for people she considered beneath her social class. Jamal's eyes locked right onto me. I could see the malicious intent brewing in his expression. He was drunk, he was entitled, and he was actively looking for a target to belittle before the dinner officially began. He dragged Sarah through the crowd, walking straight toward Julian and me, with a cruel, satisfied smirk spreading across his face. Jamal slammed his empty glass onto the mahogany bar right next to me. The bartender immediately rushed over to pour him another, keeping his head down. Jamal did not say thank you. He just grabbed the fresh drink and turned his bloodshot eyes toward Julian and me. "Well, look who finally decided to show up." Jamal slurred his voice unnecessarily loud over the elegant string quartet playing in the background. I told Dad you would not miss a chance at a free meal and top-shelf liquor. It must be a nice change of pace from whatever budget lifestyle you two are living these days. I kept my expression completely blank. Jamal was pathetic. He was nearly 40 years old and still acted like a frat boy desperately trying to impress our father. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than my first car, but he wore it like a costume. Before I could even formulate a response, Sarah stepped out from behind him. She smoothed the skirt of her heavy silk gown and gave me a tight, condescending smile. Coming from generations of old white money, Sarah had perfected the art of delivering a devastating insult wrapped in polite Southern charm. She thrived on putting me down. It was her absolute favorite sport at our family gatherings. Now, Jamal, do not be too harsh on them, Sarah said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. We should be glad they made the effort to come at all. It is good for Julian to get out and see how the other half lives. She turned her pale, sharp face toward my husband. She let her gaze travel slowly up and down his tailored suit, her eyes deliberately lingering on his lack of a flashy branded watch. It must be so incredibly intimidating for someone from your specific background to be in a room like this. Sarah continued, her tone laced with a racially coded sweetness that made my blood boil. All these executives, all this real wealth. But you should take notes, Julian. If you pay attention and learn how to network with the right kind of people, maybe you can finally move out of that little cubicle of yours. Who knows, maybe Calvin will even put in a good word for you in the mailroom. The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavily in the air. She was talking to a man whose private equity firm literally owned the supply chain her husband relied on. She was insulting a man who could buy her family's entire estate with the spare capital in his checking account. I felt a sharp protective anger flare up in my chest. I opened my mouth, fully prepared to tear her apart right there by the ice sculpture. I wanted to tell her exactly how small she really was. But before the first word could leave my lips, a heavy, suffocating grip clamped down hard on my bare shoulder. It was my father. Calvin stepped between me and my husband, his massive frame blocking my view of Julian. His grip on my shoulder was tight enough to leave a physical bruise. He did not say a word to Julian or Sarah. He simply grabbed my arm and physically pulled me away from the bar, dragging me a few feet away into a shadowed alcove near the heavy velvet curtains. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. The charming, charismatic patriarch who had just been laughing with the mayor was completely gone. "You are causing a scene just by standing here," my father hissed, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I told your mother it was a mistake to let you through the doors tonight. You always bring down the class of the room." I wrenched my arm out of his grip. "I have not said a single word to anyone," I replied, keeping my voice dead level. "Jamal is the one stumbling around drunk, and your daughter-in-law is handing out unsolicited career advice." "I do not care," Calvin snapped. He reached inside the breast pocket of his custom tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick folded piece of cream-colored paper. He shoved it forcefully against my chest, forcing me to take it. "You want to be a part of this family tonight? You are going to pay for the privilege," he demanded. I unfolded the paper. It was a formal invoice from the country club. The total balance at the bottom was bolded in heavy black ink. $4,500. It was an invoice for the imported white orchids and roses decorating the VIP table, the exact table I was forbidden from sitting at. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the ridiculous number. "You are retiring with a multi-million-dollar package, and you are trying to extort $4,000 from your scapegoat daughter for table centerpieces." My father stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "That is your required contribution to this event," he growled. "You have never pulled your weight in this family, Maya. You have always been a financial drain. You are going to log into your little bank account and wire that money to me right now." I looked up at him, studying the desperate, angry lines on his face. "Why do you need $4,000 so badly tonight, Dad?" I asked quietly. His eyes flared with a sudden panicked rage. "Do not play games with me," he warned, pointing a thick finger an inch from my face. "You will transfer those funds by midnight tonight. If the money is not in my account before the clock strikes 12, I will take the microphone at the end of the evening and publicly announce that you are permanently removed from my will. I will humiliate you in front of every single person in this city. You will leave here with absolutely nothing. Do you understand me?" He did not wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and stormed back toward the center of the room, instantly pasting his charismatic smile back onto his face as he greeted a passing city councilman. I stood alone in the alcove for a long moment. I looked down at the heavy cardstock invoice in my hands. It was the ultimate proof of his desperation. A man who truly had millions did not threaten to disown his child over the cost of floral arrangements. A man who was financially secure did not shake with panic when asked why he needed the cash. The facade was cracking, and I was the only one who could see all the broken pieces. I walked slowly back to the mahogany bar where Julian was waiting. Jamal and Sarah had already wandered off toward the dining room, looking for another tray of free appetizers to complain about. Julian looked at the piece of paper in my hands. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked profoundly amused. "Let me guess," Julian said softly as I stepped back into his space. "The billionaire patriarch is shaking you down for pocket change." $4,500, I confirmed, sliding the invoice into my clutch purse. "He said if I do not pay it by midnight, he is going to publicly disown me during his speech. He wants to make sure I leave here with nothing." Julian let out a low, rich chuckle. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. He did not say anything to comfort me because he knew I did not need comfort. He simply unlocked the screen and held it out for me to see. The screen was open to a highly encrypted corporate email server. At the very top of his inbox was a message from our lead investigative team at Vanguard Holdings. The message had been delivered exactly 2 minutes ago. I read the subject line, and a cold, beautiful sense of victory washed over my entire body. It was the culmination of months of sleepless nights, endless spreadsheets, and silent observation. The subject line read, "Forensic audit complete. Calvin and Jamal corporate embezzlement confirmed." I looked up from the glowing screen and met my husband's eyes. The trap was fully loaded. The proof was completely secured. My father had just threatened to leave me with nothing, completely unaware that by the end of this night, he would be the one walking away in handcuffs. I stared at the glowing screen of Julian's phone in the dim light of the country club alcove. The bold, black text of the encrypted email notification burned itself into my memory. Forensic audit complete. Calvin and Jamal corporate embezzlement confirmed. A slow, deeply satisfying calm washed over my entire body. I did not feel the sting of my father's extortion attempt anymore. I did not feel the lingering irritation of Sarah's racially coded insults or my mother's harsh critique of my emerald gown. All of their petty, desperate cruelties dissolved into absolute nothingness against the weight of the secret I was holding. Looking at that email pulled my mind sharply backward, transporting me to the exact moment 3 months prior when the entire illusion of my family's untouchable legacy shattered in my hands. 3 months ago, the world outside my home office windows was draped in the heavy, humid darkness of a late Atlanta summer. I was sitting behind my custom walnut desk, surrounded by glowing monitors and towering stacks of corporate tax returns, bank statements, and executive expense reports. I was not the struggling, mediocre bookkeeper my family loved to mock at their lavish dinners. I was a top-tier forensic accountant and a silent partner at Vanguard Holdings, one of the most aggressive and successful private equity firms in the Southeast. And Julian, the man my mother constantly dismissed as a low-level cubicle worker, was not an analyst. He was the founder and chief executive officer of the entire firm. Julian and I had built Vanguard Holdings from absolute scratch. We started with a single shared laptop in a cramped one-bedroom apartment 10 years ago. Julian possessed a brilliant, ruthless mind for corporate acquisitions, and I had a surgical, unforgiving eye for forensic auditing. Together, we were a devastatingly effective team. While my family spent the last decade tearing me down to make themselves feel superior, Julian and I had been quietly acquiring commercial real estate portfolios, tech startups, and massive supply chain networks. I preferred to operate in the shadows. I liked being the silent partner because it made people underestimate me. In the world of high-stakes corporate finance, an underestimated auditor is the most dangerous person in the room. The catalyst for our current situation had started as a purely strategic business move. The National Logistics Corporation, where my father served as chief financial officer, had been bleeding revenue for 5 consecutive quarters. The board of directors was panicking, desperate for a financial lifeline to avoid a public collapse. Vanguard Holdings stepped in and offered a stealth buyout. It was a highly classified, quiet acquisition that would keep the market from crashing, while Julian secured controlling shares of the entire logistics network. As part of the standard due diligence process, before finalizing the purchase, Julian brought the corporation's highly guarded financial ledgers to my home office. I treated it like any other acquisition. I did not go looking for my family's dirty laundry. I was simply doing my job, executing a standard reconciliation of their accounts payable and executive compensation packages. But on the first night of the audit, I noticed a recurring anomaly that made my blood run cold. It started with a series of bloated vendor invoices for independent consulting services. The logistics company was paying out massive monthly retainers, but those consultants were producing absolutely no tangible deliverables. I pulled the routing numbers and traced the wire transfers. The vendor addresses were nothing but commercial mailboxes in empty strip malls. The money was being routed directly into offshore holding accounts. I brewed my fourth pot of coffee, locked the door to my office, and began to dig deeper into the rot. It took me 3 sleepless nights to peel back the layers of deceit, and what I found was horrifying. My father, Calvin, and my older brother, Jamal, were not brilliant businessmen. They were not the trailblazing corporate titans my mother relentlessly bragged about to her socialite friends. They were common thieves. The numbers laid my brother's complete incompetence bare. Jamal had spent the last 2 years losing millions of dollars in botched shipping contracts and mismanaged supply routes. To hide Jamal's catastrophic failures from the board of directors, my father had been patching the holes with stolen money. Calvin was falsifying the quarterly earnings reports to make Jamal look like a corporate prodigy, ensuring his golden son was perfectly positioned for a promotion to senior vice president. But the money my father was using to cover up the deficits was not coming from the operational budget. By the second night of the audit, I traced the unauthorized wire transfers back to their exact point of origin. My father was systematically draining the corporate employees' pension fund. The man who stood at podiums and preached to the community about Black excellence legacy and the value of hard work was actively robbing his own warehouse workers, truck drivers, and administrative staff blind. He was stealing the retirement security of hundreds of hardworking innocent people just to protect his son's fragile ego and secure his own unearned reputation. By the third sleepless night, the full sickening scope of the embezzlement finally came into sharp focus. I discovered a massive $12 million gap in the pension ledgers. The stolen money was not just plugging the holes in Jamal's department, it was funding the entire facade of our family's generational wealth. I followed the $12 million straight into a complex labyrinth of shell companies, and the final destination of those stolen funds made my stomach physically turn. The money was being funneled directly into an LLC registered to my younger sister. Chloe was not a visionary entrepreneur. Her highly publicized luxury hair care line was nothing but a glorified money laundering operation. I audited her business accounts and found empty warehouses, fake manufacturing invoices, and zero actual retail revenue. The lavish launch parties, the designer inventory, the private jets, and the international distribution deals my mother never stopped bragging about were entirely paid for by the stolen life savings of my father's employees. The $12 million was gone. It had been burned on couture gowns, country club memberships, and the desperate, pathetic need to maintain the illusion of an untouchable elite dynasty. I remember sitting back in my heavy leather desk chair as the sun came up over the Atlanta skyline on that third morning. My eyes burned from staring at the monitors for 72 hours straight, but the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the absolute psychological clarity that washed over me. My entire life, my parents had called me a disappointment. They had excluded me from family vacations, mocked my budget-friendly clothes, and relentlessly belittled my husband. I finally understood why. They needed me to be the failure of the family, because they were projecting their own profound criminal inadequacy onto me. They had to constantly push me down to distract themselves from the fact that their entire existence was a fragile, fraudulent house of cards. They resented my quiet, honest life because it was a glaring reminder of the integrity they completely lacked. Julian had walked into my office that morning bringing me a fresh cup of tea. He took one look at the cascading spreadsheets on my monitors, then looked at my face. I did not have to say a single word. He leaned over my shoulder reading the final forensic audit report. I felt his jaw tighten with cold, controlled fury as he saw the exact dollar amounts my father had stolen from the pension fund. In the corporate world, finding a $12 million embezzlement scheme during due diligence was grounds to instantly terminate an acquisition and call the federal authorities. Julian asked me what I wanted to do. I looked at the numbers, thinking about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant humiliation, and the sheer arrogance of my family. I told Julian to proceed with the buyout. I told him to finalize the paperwork, secure the controlling shares of the corporation, and lock my father and my brother into the trap. We spent the next 3 months working in absolute disciplined silence. We let my family continue to gloat. We let them plan this lavish, obscenely expensive retirement gala. We let my father preen and boast about his flawless career, knowing the entire time that we held the match that would burn his fraudulent empire to the ground. The memory faded, bringing me squarely back to the present moment in the shadowed alcove of the country club. I looked at the secure email notification on Julian's phone one more time. The official forensic report was locked, sealed, and legally binding. The trap was armed and ready to snap shut. Julian slipped his phone back into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. He offered me his arm, his demeanor shifting seamlessly back to the polite, unassuming husband my family thought he was. I took his arm, my posture straight, and my chin held high. It was time to take our seats for dinner. It was time to let Jamal boast about his unearned promotions and let Sarah brag about her stolen wealth. It was time to watch them feast, knowing it would be their last meal in high society. The event coordinator gestured for the guests to take their seats, signaling the official start of the evening. The massive ballroom was a sea of motion as 200 of Atlanta's most elite socialites, politicians, and corporate executives began to find their assigned tables. Julian placed a hand on the small of my back, guiding me through the shifting crowd. We did not have to search very long to find our place. My father had orchestrated the seating chart with the same malicious, calculating precision he used to manipulate his company's financial ledgers. The host led us to table 47. It was not just located in the back of the room. It was practically in a different zip code entirely. We were wedged into a narrow, dimly lit, and incredibly drafty corner, directly beside the main swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every 30 seconds, a server would burst through the heavy wooden doors, carrying wide silver trays, piled high with clattering silverware and steaming plates of roasted duck. The loud, chaotic noise of the kitchen staff shouting culinary orders completely drowned out the elegant string quartet playing at the front of the ballroom. A harsh metallic draft from an industrial air conditioning vent blew aggressively down from the ceiling, hitting the back of my exposed neck. My father wanted to make absolutely certain that I spent the entire evening dodging anxious busboys and smelling industrial dish soap. He wanted me to feel utterly insignificant, shoved into the shadows like an unwanted secret while he basked in the golden spotlight of his manufactured legacy. I pulled out my chair. The wooden legs scraped loudly against a scuffed, unpolished section of the marble floor that the event decorators had not even bothered to cover with a rug. Julian sat down beside me. His long legs were cramped under the tiny, poorly draped table, but his demeanor remained flawless. He did not complain about the draft or the noise. He simply adjusted his tailored cuffs, settled back into his uncomfortable chair, and looked out across the vast sea of tables toward the front of the room. He exuded the quiet, dangerous patience of a king observing his court. The VIP table was situated on a raised, tiered platform directly in front of the main stage. It was a sprawling, opulent display of extravagant wealth, draped in heavy imported silk, and overflowing with the exact same expensive white orchids my father had just tried to force me to pay for. Jamal was seated at the absolute center of the floral arrangement, acting as if this retirement gala was actually a royal coronation ceremony designed exclusively for him. I was completely lacking in basic self-awareness. His voice boomed over the polite chatter of the surrounding executives, amplified by the impressive acoustics of the vaulted ballroom ceiling. He had clearly switched from his earlier scotch to vintage champagne, and the steady flow of expensive alcohol had dissolved whatever thin professional filter he normally possessed. I could hear every single arrogant word he said. I was leaning heavily across the white tablecloth, aggressively gesturing with his champagne flute toward a group of senior board members seated at the adjacent table. He was bragging loudly about the impending corporate acquisition. It was almost physically painful to listen to his profound stupidity. Jamal was loudly explaining how his brilliant strategic maneuvers over the past 3 quarters had single-handedly attracted the attention of a massive, ruthless private equity firm. He puffed out his chest using complex corporate buzzwords completely out of context. I was totally blind to the reality that his catastrophic departmental failures and massive financial deficits were the exact reason the company was bleeding cash and required a hostile takeover in the first place. He boasted that the ink on the buyout paperwork was practically dry. He promised the board members and anyone else within a 50-foot radius that the moment the corporate transition was finalized, his executive stock options would immediately vest. He proudly proclaimed that he was about to become a highly liquid multimillionaire before the month was over. He raised his glass high in the air, toasting his own fabricated genius, while the board members offered him tight, uncomfortable smiles. Sarah, sitting rigidly beside him, was certainly not about to let her husband take all the credit for their imaginary stolen fortune. She leaned eagerly into the conversation, her heavy diamond jewelry catching the harsh glare of the stage lights. She practically shouted over the music to the wife of the city mayor sitting 2 tables away, desperate to make sure her voice carried above the clinking of fine china. Sarah announced to the entire front row that she and Jamal were closing on a massive custom-built beachfront estate in the Hamptons next Tuesday. She described the luxury property in excruciating, boastful detail. She talked endlessly about the imported Italian marble countertops, the private infinity pool overlooking the ocean, and the climate-controlled wine cellar she was having custom designed by a Parisian architect. She laughed a high, shrill, deeply grating sound, claiming that Jamal's massive buyout bonus was the perfect excuse to finally upgrade their lifestyle to a standard she was historically accustomed to. She looked incredibly smug, completely convinced of her own untouchable superiority. She thrived on making sure everyone in the room knew exactly how much money she was about to spend. I sat at my drafty table by the kitchen doors, sipping my ice water, watching this spectacular performance of pure delusion. It was a masterclass in unearned entitlement. As a forensic accountant who had just spent 3 sleepless nights tearing their financial records apart, the irony was thick enough to choke on. Every single dollar they were bragging about, every penny of that Hamptons vacation home, and every drop of that vintage champagne was paid for with the stolen retirement funds of the very warehouse workers who had spent 30 years building my father's company. They were feasting on stolen time and stolen futures, parading around in couture gowns purchased with the life savings of innocent administrative staff. I glanced sideways at Julian. He was watching the VIP table with the cold, detached fascination of an apex predator, watching its prey wander blindly into a steel snare. The profound irony of Jamal bragging about a Vanguard Holdings corporate buyout directly to the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings was almost too poetic to be real. Jamal was enthusiastically digging his own grave and bragging about the quality of the shovel. The first course of seared scallops and microgreens was just being cleared away by the rushing waitstaff when the atmosphere in the back of the room suddenly shifted. The heavy brass-handled double doors leading out to the main lobby did not just open. They were pushed wide apart with a sharp, commanding force that immediately caught my attention. A man stepped into the ballroom, bringing a sudden rush of cool lobby air with him. He was clearly not a guest on the invitation list, and he was certainly not part of the country club catering staff. He was a corporate courier dressed in a sharp, immaculate black suit that screamed federal compliance and high-level corporate security. He carried no food tray or champagne flute. In his right hand he held a thick, heavily classified black folder, securely sealed with a tamper-evident red security band running across the flap. In the corporate world, a red seal on a black folder meant only one thing: It meant final legally binding signatures on a major merger and acquisition. It meant the deal was officially closed. The courier did not pause to admire the lavish ballroom decorations or the towering ice sculptures. He did not even glance toward the brightly lit VIP table where my family sat holding court and sipping champagne. He bypassed the wealthy socialites, the local politicians, and the corporate executives entirely. His sharp eyes scanned the darkened perimeter of the room until he found table 47. He walked with a brisk, purposeful stride, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor, cutting a straight line directly toward the kitchen doors. He marched straight up to our drafty, cramped table, stopping squarely in front of my husband. Without a single word, the courier extended his hand and presented the sealed black folder directly to Julian. The corporate courier handed the heavily classified black folder directly to Julian. My husband did not hesitate. He took the heavy document, his large hands gripping the thick leather casing with complete familiarity. The courier gave a single crisp nod of professional acknowledgement, turned on his heel, and marched right back out the swinging double doors into the lobby. He was gone as quickly as he had appeared, but the impact of his brief arrival immediately rippled through the front of the room. From my vantage point at table 47, I watched my younger sister Chloe narrow her eyes. She was sitting at the VIP table flanked by her wealthy friends, holding a glass of rose champagne. Chloe hated when anyone else received attention. She thrived on being the absolute center of gravity in any room she occupied. Seeing a high-level corporate courier bypass her completely to deliver a secure package to the sister she considered a failure was entirely unacceptable to her fragile ego. She slammed her champagne flute down onto the table. I watched her whisper something harsh to my mother before gathering the voluminous skirts of her sequined designer gown. She marched down the tiered steps of the VIP platform, her heels striking the marble floor with aggressive, entitled force. She was making a direct line for our drafty corner next to the kitchen doors. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I could feel Julian shifting slightly beside me, placing the black folder flat onto the table and resting his hand over the red security seal. Chloe arrived at our table, crossing her arms over her chest. She glared down at us, her lip curled in a familiar expression of deep disgust. "What was that all about?" Chloe demanded, her voice loud enough to turn the heads of the guests sitting at the adjacent tables. "Who was that guy in the suit, and why is he handing deliveries to Julian? This is an exclusive retirement gala, Maya, not a mailroom. You cannot just have your husband's cheap budget spreadsheets delivered here." "It is just some light reading for the evening," Julian said smoothly. His voice was incredibly calm, revealing absolutely nothing. Chloe scoffed, flipping her long hair over her shoulder. "Whatever. Listen to me very carefully, Maya. I have a major problem, and you are going to fix it right now. 6 of my sorority sisters just arrived late, and the event staff completely messed up their seating arrangements. They are scattered all over the room, and they need to sit together so we can take group photos for my social media pages." She gestured flippantly toward my chair, then toward Julian's. "So you two need to get up," Chloe ordered. "Give up this table. You can just go stand by the bar near the coat check for the rest of the dinner. It is not like anyone actually wants to talk to you anyway. You are just taking up valuable space." I stared at her, completely unfazed by her sheer audacity. I had spent 35 years watching her pull these kinds of stunts. She genuinely believed that my sole purpose on this earth was to be her convenient stepping stone. "I am not giving up my seat, Chloe," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "We were assigned this table by Dad. If your friends arrived late, that is their problem. They can sit where the coordinator placed them." Chloe gasped, her eyes widening in dramatic, exaggerated shock. "Are you seriously defying me right now? You are literally ruining my night." Before she could launch into a full-blown temper tantrum, the sharp scent of expensive floral perfume hit my nose. My mother Valerie suddenly appeared behind Chloe. She had clearly seen her golden child looking distressed and rushed over from the VIP table to intervene. "What is going on here?" Valerie snapped, her eyes darting between me and Chloe. "Why are you raising your voice, Chloe, darling?" "Mom, Maya is being completely unreasonable," Chloe whined, instantly adopting the voice of a victimized child. I just asked her to move to the bar so my friends could sit together and she is refusing. She is deliberately trying to ruin my photos. Valerie turned her furious gaze onto me, her hands planted firmly on her hips, her heavy silk gown rustling around her legs. Maya, why must you always make things so difficult? My mother scolded, her voice, laced with intense disappointment. You are embarrassing the family again. Your sister is running a highly successful beauty empire. Her friends are vital to her networking. You are doing absolutely nothing important tonight. Get up right now and obey your sister. Go stand by the bar. I felt a cold rush of adrenaline course through my veins. The blatant disrespect was staggering, but I did not even have to open my mouth to defend myself. Julian shifted in his chair. He did not stand up. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked up at my mother with a gaze so dark and commanding that she instinctively took a half-step backward. "My wife is not moving an inch," Julian said. His voice was low, carrying a dangerous, razor-sharp edge that completely shattered the polite country club atmosphere. "We are staying seated exactly where we are. If your other daughter has an issue with the seating arrangements, she can take it up with the venue management. But you will never speak to Maya that way again." Valerie gasped, her hand flying up to touch her diamond necklace. She looked at Julian as if he had just slapped her across the face. In her world, low-level analysts did not speak to wealthy society matriarchs with such absolute authority. "Excuse me," a sharp, condescending voice called out from the crowd. Sarah, my brother Jamal's white wife, pushed her way past my mother. She had followed Valerie from the VIP table, always eager to insert herself into a situation where she could assert her generational wealth and tear me down. She stood next to Chloe, crossing her arms, her pale face flushed with indignant anger. "You need to learn how to speak to your betters, Julian." Sarah snapped, her tone dripping with racial microaggressions. "You are a guest in our world. You are only here because Calvin took pity on Maya. You really need to know your place in rooms like this before you find yourself escorted out by security. You are nothing but a minor corporate drone." The sheer arrogance radiating from Sarah was blinding. She stood there in her couture gown, looking down her nose at the man who could dismantle her entire reality with a single phone call. I looked at Sarah. I looked at the smug satisfaction on her face, and I decided that I was done playing the quiet scapegoat. The trap was ready. The folder was on the table. It was time to draw the first drop of blood. I rested my elbows on the table and looked directly into Sarah's pale blue eyes. "You talk a lot about knowing your place, Sarah," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the room. "You love to remind everyone about your family's generational wealth. You love bragging about that new beachfront vacation home you and Jamal are closing on next week." Sarah tilted her chin up, a haughty smile forming on her lips. "That is because Jamal and I actually understand success, Maya, something you will never grasp." I smiled back at her. It was a terrifying, calculating smile. "Success is an interesting word," I replied casually. "I personally find it fascinating how you can define success while completely ignoring the $50 million federal tax lien the Internal Revenue Service just placed on your family's primary estate." The haughty smile instantly vanished from Sarah's face. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking completely ghost pale. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. I continued, my voice steady and surgical. "Yes, I know all about it, Sarah. Your father has been dodging federal taxes for the last 12 years. The government froze all of your family's domestic assets 3 days ago. Your generational wealth is a complete illusion. You are bankrupt. And the only reason you are closing on that Hamptons house next week is because Jamal used stolen corporate funds to cover your family's massive legal debts." Sarah took a stumbling step backward. Her hands began to shake violently. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated horror. She had spent years hiding her family's financial ruin behind a wall of arrogant privilege, and I had just ripped it away in front of my mother and sister. "How," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling so badly it was barely audible. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I pay attention to the things that actually matter," I said coldly. "You should really focus on finding a good bankruptcy lawyer instead of worrying about my seating arrangements." Chloe and Valerie stared at Sarah, their expressions morphing from anger to profound confusion. They had no idea what I was talking about. They had no idea that their perfect daughter-in-law was completely broke. Sarah could not even defend herself. She turned away, pushing frantically through the crowd, desperate to escape the devastating truth I had just exposed. Valerie looked at me, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about, Maya?" my mother demanded, her voice shaking. "What tax lien? What stolen funds?" Before I could answer her, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The bright golden light from the crystal chandeliers suddenly dimmed. A hush fell over the entire crowd as the string quartet stopped playing. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the center of the main stage. My father, Calvin, confidently strutted up the wooden steps to the podium. He adjusted his silk bow tie and smiled broadly at the 200 guests, soaking in the thunderous applause that erupted through the room. He looked incredibly proud. He looked untouchable. He grabbed the microphone, completely unaware that his entire life was about to end. He was completely unaware that the heavy black folder sitting on my table contained his absolute destruction. The trap was fully set. "Let me begin by thanking all of you for being here tonight." My father's voice boomed through the speakers. Julian picked up the black folder. He looked at me, and I nodded. It was time. The heavy black folder rested on our small table by the kitchen doors. Julian ran his thumb over the tamper, evident red security seal. The thick plastic band yielded with a sharp, satisfying snap that was completely swallowed by the sound of 200 people clapping for my father. Up on the main stage, Calvin adjusted his silk bow tie. He gripped the edges of the acrylic podium and leaned into the microphone, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. While my father smiled for the flashing cameras, Julian calmly flipped open the heavy leather cover of the folder. He slid the contents toward me, keeping the documents perfectly aligned on the white tablecloth. I looked down at the crisp watermarked pages. It was the absolute culmination of 3 months of sleepless nights and relentless forensic auditing. The first document was the final unredacted filing from the Securities and Exchange Commission. It explicitly detailed the massive financial deficits, the hidden shell accounts, and the $12 million of missing pension funds. Every single stolen penny I had traced was now officially logged in a federal financial register. Beneath the federal audit lay the acquisition paperwork. It was dozens of pages of dense binding corporate law, but the only page that mattered was the one resting right on top. It bore the signature of the outgoing chairman of the board, transferring 80% of the corporate voting shares directly to Vanguard Holdings. The transition was immediate, binding, and entirely irreversible. My father did not know it yet, but he was standing on a stage paid for by a company he no longer worked for. He was wearing a custom tuxedo funded by a bank account that was currently being frozen. He was entirely, completely powerless. Julian rested his hand over the documents, his gold wedding band catching the dim light. We sat in the shadows of the ballroom, holding the literal ownership of my family's entire legacy, and listened to my father begin to speak. "Let me begin by thanking all of you for being here tonight." Calvin projected his voice, smooth and incredibly charismatic. He sounded like a man who believed his own lies. Reaching this milestone gives a man time to reflect on what truly matters. We spend our lives building businesses, securing contracts, and accumulating wealth. But a true legacy is measured by the family we leave behind to carry the torch. A polite murmur of agreement washed over the crowd. I watched my mother Valerie dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. She was playing the role of the devoted, emotional wife, completely ignoring the fact that her daughter-in-law had just fled the room in a state of financial terror. Calvin gestured grandly toward the VIP table, his face beaming with manufactured pride. He turned his attention to my older brother first. "When I look at Jamal," my father continued, his voice swelling with emotion, "I see the future of the logistics industry. I see an unmatched business intellect. Jamal has closed our most challenging accounts and navigated our most difficult quarters with the grace of a seasoned titan. He is a man who understands the weight of our family name." Jamal raised his glass of champagne to the room, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was missing. He grinned like a fool, soaking in the applause. He had no idea that the federal audit sitting on my table explicitly named him as a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. He was celebrating his own impending arrest. My father then turned his proud gaze toward Chloe, who was sitting up perfectly straight, to ensure the photographers captured her good side. "And then there is my Chloe," Calvin said, placing a hand over his heart. "A true visionary, a creative genius who took the beauty industry by storm. She possesses a relentless entrepreneurial spirit that inspires me every single day. She proves that the entrepreneurial drive runs deep in our blood." More applause echoed through the ballroom. Chloe offered a modest, practiced wave to the crowd. She was lapping up the praise, utterly blind to the reality that her luxury hair care line was nothing but a hollow shell company used to launder the retirement funds of the catering staff currently serving her dinner. I sat perfectly still, listening to this grotesque theater of validation. My father was building them up so high, placing them on towering pedestals of fabricated success just so he could use the contrast to crush me. I knew the pivot was coming. I could feel the atmosphere in the room begin to shift as the warmth slowly drained from my father's voice. The smile vanished from his face. His posture stiffened. The charismatic, loving patriarch disappeared, replaced by the cruel, calculating man I had known my entire life. He stopped looking at the VIP table. His eyes scanned over the heads of the wealthy socialites and powerful politicians, piercing through the dim lighting until they locked directly onto me. He found me sitting at the drafty table in the back, right next to the kitchen doors. The silence in the ballroom became heavy and suffocating. The guests sensed the sudden dramatic shift in tone. "When you build an empire," my father said, his voice turning cold and sharp, "you quickly learn that you are only as strong as your weakest link. True legacy requires excellence. It requires children who honor the sacrifices made for them. Only the children who made me proud are truly mine." He paused, letting the devastating insult hang in the air. Hundreds of heads began to turn. The elite guests twisted in their chairs, following his glare toward the back of the room. "As for the one who chose a life of mediocrity," my father continued, his voice echoing relentlessly through the massive speakers. "The one who rejected every opportunity I provided, who refused to understand the standards of this family, and who brought a struggling nobody into our circle. You do not belong at this table. You do not belong in this room. You can leave." We had officially reached the breaking point. This was the exact moment he intended to break my spirit, to publicly humiliate me into submission, to force me to run away in tears so he could feel like a god. Valerie looked away, staring intently at the floral arrangements. Chloe let out a short, highly audible laugh, raising her champagne glass to her lips. They were waiting for me to shatter. I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the marble floor. I stood up slowly. I kept my spine completely rigid and my shoulders squared. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown, maintaining absolute composure. I did not shed a single tear. I looked my father dead in the eye, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Before my hand could even reach for my clutch purse, Julian stood up beside me. He did not rush. He did not look angry or intimidated. He projected an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He reached over, picked up my clutch, and handed it to me. Then he stepped away from the table, leaving the black folder resting securely next to my water glass. Julian walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, parting the sea of staring guests. My father gripped the edges of the podium, his face turning red with sudden, furious indignation as he watched Julian approach the stage. The event coordinator rushed forward, holding up a hand to intervene, but Julian silenced him with a single commanding look. The coordinator instinctively stepped back and handed Julian the spare microphone. Julian stopped at the base of the stage. He calmly buttoned his tailored suit jacket. He looked up at my father, who was now visibly seething behind the podium. Julian raised the microphone to his mouth and smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile that promised absolute ruin. "We will gladly leave," Calvin Julian said, his deep voice carrying perfectly through the massive speakers and freezing the blood of every person in the room. "But before we do, as the new majority shareholder of your company, I think we need to discuss your severed pension." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. The sudden earth-shattering revelation hung in the air, shifting the balance of power in an instant. My father staggered back a half step, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the acrylic podium. The arrogant certainty was completely wiped from his face, replaced by a profound dawning terror. Julian did not say another word to him. He slowly lowered the microphone to his side, his eyes never leaving my father's pale face. Without breaking eye contact, Julian lifted his left hand and gave a subtle, deliberate nod toward the soundboard booth at the very back of the ballroom. I was signaling the audiovisual team. It was a team my father thought he had hired, but it was actually a highly specialized corporate media crew that Julian had secretly brought in and paid for 3 weeks ago. The trap was springing shut. The execution was about to begin. Julian lowered the microphone he had just taken from the stunned event coordinator. He did not look at my mother, who was still fuming near the ice sculpture, and he did not look at my sister Chloe, who was sitting at the VIP table with her arms crossed in annoyance. Julian kept his eyes locked squarely on my father standing behind the acrylic podium on the main stage. Without breaking that intense eye contact, Julian lifted his left hand. He gave a single deliberate nod toward the soundboard booth at the very back of the sprawling ballroom. Up on the stage, Calvin was mid-sentence. He was aggressively gripping the edges of the podium, his chest puffed out as he preached to the 200 elite guests about the sacred value of family loyalty and the uncompromising standards of our legacy. He was completely in his element, soaking up the admiring gazes of Atlanta's most powerful politicians and corporate tycoons. Then the audio cut out. My father's booming, charismatic voice was abruptly severed, replaced by a sharp split-second burst of static that made a few people in the front row wince. Calvin tapped the head of the microphone with his index finger. He cleared his throat and tried to speak again, assuming it was a simple technical glitch. No sound came out. The audiovisual team at the back of the room, the team my father thought the country club had provided, but who were actually highly specialized corporate media technicians, Julian had secretly hired 3 weeks ago, had completely killed my father's audio feed. Calvin frowned, his perfectly curated public smile slipping for a fraction of a second. He waved a hand impatiently toward the event staff standing in the wings, demanding a replacement microphone. But the dead microphone was only the beginning. The massive high-definition projection screens, spanning the entire back wall of the stage, suddenly flickered. The heartwarming, carefully edited slideshow of my father's 30-year corporate career photos, of him shaking hands with mayors, cutting ribbons at new distribution centers, and posing on golf courses with wealthy board members vanished instantly. The screens plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the sea of seated guests. People began to put down their forks and champagne flutes, murmuring to one another as the glittering ballroom took on an eerie, tense atmosphere. Then a brilliant, crisp gold logo materialized against the stark black background of the screens. It was minimalist, sharp, and undeniably powerful. Beneath the glowing emblem, bold white text faded into view. Vanguard Holdings. Calvin turned around. He stared up at the massive projection of the logo looming over his head. His brow furrowed in deep confusion. He did not understand what he was looking at. He had spent the last several months desperately trying to secure a financial lifeline for his bleeding logistics company, but he had never been permitted to know the name of the private equity firm executing the stealth buyout. Only the chairman of the board held that classified information. The golden logo held the screen for exactly 5 seconds, just long enough to burn itself into the retinas of every executive in the room. Then the screen shifted. High-resolution scans of legal documents appeared, projected so large that the fine print was legible from the very back row where I was sitting. They were the final, fully executed corporate acquisition papers. The digital signature of the outgoing chairman of the board was stamped clearly at the bottom of the page, officially transferring 80% of the corporation's voting shares directly to Vanguard Holdings. The ballroom was filled with some of the most ruthless, intelligent corporate executives in the Southeast. They knew exactly what they were looking at. The confused whispers instantly transformed into a wave of sharp collective gasps. The guests realized in real time that they were not attending a celebratory retirement gala anymore. They were actively witnessing a hostile corporate takeover. Julian did not wait for my father to process the information. He placed his foot on the bottom step of the stage and began to ascend. He did not ask for permission to take the floor. He walked up those stairs with the heavy, unhurried stride of a man who literally owned the building, the stage, and every single paycheck of the executives sitting in the front row. He stopped right next to the podium. He stood inches away from my father. Calvin looked at Julian, his eyes wide with a mixture of outrage and dawning terror. My father was a man who relied on loud intimidation to maintain control, but stripped of his microphone and his authority, he suddenly looked incredibly small. Julian raised his own microphone to his mouth. The live audio feed cracked like a whip through the silent ballroom. "Good evening," Julian said, his deep, commanding voice vibrating through the crystal chandeliers overhead. "For those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Julian. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings." The reaction at the VIP table was immediate and catastrophic. Sarah, who had just minutes ago insulted Julian by telling him to learn his place and stay in his cubicle, dropped her vintage champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered loudly against the marble platform, splashing expensive alcohol across her couture gown. All the haughty old money arrogance evaporated from her pale face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She was staring at the man she had just racially profiled and belittled, realizing that he held the power to eradicate her entire existence with a single signature. Jamal gripped the edges of the VIP table, his knuckles turning white. His drunken, entitled swagger completely collapsed. He stared up at the massive projection screens, looking at the acquisition documents that proved the company he thought he was going to inherit had just been sold out from under him. My mother Valerie brought a trembling hand to her throat. She looked like she was going to faint. The society matriarch, who had spent the entire cocktail hour mocking Julian's suit and calling him a struggling nobody, was now completely paralyzed, trapped in the nightmarish reality that her scapegoat daughter had married a billionaire. Julian turned his body slightly, directing his full, terrifying attention squarely onto my father. "Calvin," Julian said, his voice clinical, sharp, and legally precise. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, the board of directors finalized a stealth acquisition. Vanguard Holdings is now the majority shareholder and the immediate governing body of this entire logistics network. Which means, effective immediately, you no longer work for the company you are currently attempting to give a speech about." My father's mouth opened and closed. He looked out at the 200 elite guests, his eyes pleading for anyone to intervene. But no one moved. The local politicians and wealthy doctors were absolutely captivated by the destruction unfolding on the stage. Julian was not finished. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a single folded sheet of heavy corporate letterhead. "Furthermore," Julian continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "under the legal stipulations of this buyout, and pending an active federal investigation into your departmental ledgers, your executive severance package has been formally revoked, your stock options are voided, and your entire corporate pension has been permanently severed due to gross financial misconduct." Calvin let out a choked, desperate sound. He lunged forward, grabbing Julian's forearm, forgetting that he was standing on a brightly lit stage in front of the entire Atlanta high society. "You cannot do this," Calvin rasped, his voice raw and shaking. "I built this company. I am the chief financial officer. You are a liability," Julian corrected smoothly, effortlessly, shrugging off my father's desperate grip. "And you are a thief." Jamal could not take it anymore. The golden son, the man who believed he was untouchable, scrambled up from the VIP table. He stumbled up the side steps of the stage, his face flushed purple with a mix of rage and heavy scotch. "You have no right to do this to us," Jamal shouted, pointing an unsteady finger at Julian's chest. "I am the senior vice president of this division. You cannot just walk in here and void my stock options. I have a legally binding contract with this corporation." Julian slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The look of profound, icy disgust on my husband's face made Jamal freeze in his tracks. "You are unemployed," Julian stated, his words hitting the golden child like physical blows. "You are officially terminated as of this exact second. Your contracts are dissolved. Your access to the corporate accounts has been frozen. You do not have stock options because you do not have a job." Jamal staggered backward, bumping into the acrylic podium. He looked down at Sarah, who was still sitting frozen at the VIP table amidst the shattered glass of her champagne flute. The reality of their total financial ruin was crashing down on them in real time. The Hamptons beach house they had bragged about, the luxury cars, the generational wealth they thought they were entitled to, it was all completely gone. The ballroom was absolutely electrified. The guests were holding their breath, witnessing the total systematic dismantling of my family's fraudulent dynasty. Julian had single-handedly stripped my father and brother of their titles, their money and their power in less than 3 minutes. But Julian knew exactly who was supposed to deliver the final fatal blow. He did not look at my mother, who was silently weeping at the VIP table. He did not look at Chloe, who was frantically deleting the arrogant social media posts she had made earlier in the evening. Julian turned his back on my father and brother. He looked out across the vast shadowed ballroom, his eyes finding me where I was standing tall and composed next to the kitchen doors. He extended his hand toward me, an invitation and a summons all at once. However, I did not uncover this profound corporate rot alone, Julian announced to the silent, captivated crowd. I think Vanguard's lead forensic auditor has a few words to share with the room. Julian extended his hand toward me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. I let go of the small table near the kitchen doors. I did not look down at the floor the way my mother had always trained me to do. I kept my chin perfectly level and my shoulders squared. The soft rustle of my emerald silk gown was the only sound accompanying my footsteps as I walked down the center aisle of the room. For 35 years, I had been the invisible middle child. I was the scapegoat, the ultimate disappointment, the easy punchline to every cruel joke told at the VIP table. But as I placed my foot on the first wooden step of the main stage, that version of me ceased to exist completely. I was not the victim anymore. I looked exactly like the executioner. I climbed the steps with slow, deliberate precision. I felt the intense burning stare of 200 elite socialites and corporate executives pressing into my skin. They were expecting a dramatic scene. They were expecting an emotional meltdown from a jealous, bitter daughter. They were completely unprepared for the absolute clinical destruction I was about to unleash upon my family. Julian met me at the center of the stage. He handed me the microphone. His warm fingers brushed against mine, transferring a silent, steady surge of power and solidarity. He took a respectful step back, giving me the floor entirely. I turned to face the massive crowd. I did not glare at my father, who was standing frozen just a few feet away, clutching the acrylic podium like a life raft. I did not look at my mother, who was pressing her hands over her mouth in sheer horror. I looked straight out at the powerful executives sitting in the front rows. I raised the microphone. "Good evening," I said. My voice echoed through the vast ballroom, crystal clear and utterly devoid of any trembling emotion. As Julian mentioned, I am the lead forensic auditor for Vanguard Holdings. For the past 3 months, I have been conducting a comprehensive due diligence review of this logistics corporation prior to tonight's final acquisition. What I uncovered was not a record of stellar corporate leadership. It was a staggering, highly coordinated financial crime. I reached into my sleek clutch and pulled out a small wireless presentation remote. I pressed my thumb against the forward button. Behind me, the massive high-definition projection screens shifted instantly. The golden Vanguard logo dissolved, replaced by a towering, incredibly detailed financial flowchart. The diagram was a complex, tangled web of red lines, banking routing numbers, and offshore account destinations. The sheer magnitude of the chart drew sharp, audible gasps from the board members seated near the front. They were looking at their own company's internal ledgers, completely exposed for the entire world to scrutinize. Let us look at the reality of Jamal's unmatched business intellect. I continued, my voice steady and completely unforgiving. I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a specific section of the flowchart, highlighting massive quarterly deficits in bright red ink. Over the last 24 months, Jamal has single-handedly lost 3 major shipping contracts through gross negligence and the highly unauthorized use of corporate expense accounts. His division was hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented, catastrophic rate. To hide this colossal failure from the board of directors and secure his impending promotion, An elaborate cover-up was engineered. I pointed to the very top of the flowchart, where my father's official executive signature was digitally projected next to a series of fraudulent wire transfers. The chief financial officer authorized a systematic draining of the corporate employee pension fund, I announced. The words struck the silent room with the devastating force of a physical blow. You heard that correctly. The retirement savings of your warehouse workers, your delivery drivers, and your dedicated administrative staff were secretly and maliciously liquidated. The total amount embezzled stands at exactly $12,450,000. Absolute pandemonium began to break out in the ballroom. Executives were standing up from their chairs in pure shock. Voices were rising in outrage and disbelief. I saw one of the senior board members pull out his phone, his face pale with furious indignation. But I was not finished dismantling the illusion. I raised my voice slightly, cutting cleanly through the rising chaos of the crowd. I clicked the remote a third time. The projection screen shifted from the corporate ledgers to a damning series of empty warehouse photos, fake manufacturing invoices, and a complex web of dummy LLC registrations. That $12 million did not just patch the bleeding holes in Jamal's department, I stated, aiming my cold gaze directly at the VIP table where my younger sister was sitting. It was funneled through a sophisticated labyrinth of offshore holding accounts to fund a lifestyle built entirely on theft. The final destination for the stolen pension money was a company registered to Chloe. Chloe bolted upright in her chair. The sequined fabric of her expensive couture gown caught the bright stage lights as she frantically shook her head. Her wealthy sorority sisters and socialite friends physically recoiled from her, pulling their chairs away abruptly, as if she were a contagious disease. Your visionary entrepreneurial spirit is a complete fabrication. Chloe, I said, speaking directly to her over the booming sound system. Your luxury hair care line has zero retail revenue. You have not paid your overseas manufacturers in 8 months. The distribution warehouses are completely empty. Your entire business is nothing but a money laundering shell company designed to clean the funds your father stole from his own employees. Every designer dress you wear, every first-class flight you take, and every single drop of champagne you are drinking tonight was paid for by the stolen futures of innocent, hardworking people. The devastation was absolute and total. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her perfect, arrogant facade crumbling into a pathetic mess of panicked tears. Sarah, who had been sitting frozen since Julian's initial announcement, looked at Jamal with a mixture of terror and deep, visceral disgust. The old money heiress realized in that exact moment that she had married a common criminal who had just destroyed her social standing forever. My mother Valerie was openly sobbing into her napkin, her high society friends actively ignoring her distress to whisper furiously among themselves. I looked at the data glowing brightly behind me. The mathematical precision of my forensic audit left absolutely zero room for denial, argument, or misinterpretation. It was ironclad. It was flawless. I had taken every single insult, every harsh rejection, and every moment they made me feel like I was not enough, and I had transformed it into undeniable, irrefutable evidence of their destruction. I had not just defeated them emotionally. I had mathematically erased their entire legacy. I turned my attention back to my father. Calvin was no longer frozen behind the acrylic podium. The initial shock had worn off completely, replaced by a violent, explosive rage. His perfectly curated image of the dignified, wealthy patriarch shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of my eyes. His face turned a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The thick veins in his neck bulged prominently against his tight silk collar. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire universe burn to ashes and suddenly realized he was the one holding the match. He stepped aggressively away from the podium, his large hands curled into tight, trembling fists. He was shaking with a fury so profound it looked like it might tear him apart from the inside out. He glared at me with a blazing hatred that was completely unhinged and wild. "Shut that screen off!" Calvin roared, his voice cracking with raw desperation and blinding rage. His unamplified scream echoed violently over the shocked murmurs of the elite crowd. "Shut it down right now. You lying, ungrateful little brat. I will destroy you for this. I will ruin you." He did not care that 200 elite guests were watching him completely lose his mind. He did not care that the powerful board of directors was sitting 20 feet away, actively listening to him threaten his own daughter. He was completely blinded by the catastrophic collapse of his fraudulent empire. He could not comprehend that the daughter he had spent a lifetime treating like garbage was the architect of his demise. Calvin spun around his chest, heaving as he waved his arms frantically toward the back of the sprawling ballroom, where the dark silhouettes of the security personnel were stationed near the heavy exit doors. "Security!" my father screamed at the top of his lungs, flecks of spit flying from his lips in his panic. "Where is the security for this venue? Get in here right now. Get up on this stage and drag this lying outsider out of my building. I want her physically removed from this premises immediately. I want her thrown out into the street. Grab her." The booming echo of my father's voice, demanding my removal, hung heavily in the chilled air of the ballroom. He stood there on the main stage, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, violently pointing a trembling finger in my direction. He was screaming for security, his pristine public mask completely shattered. For decades, Calvin had ruled his corporate empire and his family with an iron fist, convinced that his mere volume could bend reality to his will. The 200 elite guests, the politicians, the neurosurgeons, the socialites who had just been applauding him, now sat in stunned, breathless silence. They were watching a man unravel in real time. At the back of the room, the heavy brass-handled double doors swung open with a resounding thud. 6 burly security guards marched into the grand foyer. They were massive, imposing men, dressed in immaculate black suits, with discreet earpieces curled around their necks. They moved with the synchronized, predatory grace of a highly trained tactical unit. My father let out a harsh, triumphant bark of a laugh. He gripped the acrylic podium, his chest puffing out as he watched the guards advance down the center aisle. He thought he had won. He genuinely believed that his authority in this country club was absolute. He pointed at me again, his eyes wide with malicious glee. "Grab her," my father commanded, his voice raw and echoing across the crystal chandeliers. "Grab this ungrateful liar and throw her out onto the street. I want her physically removed from my sight. Do not let her take another step." I stood my ground. I did not step behind Julian. I did not lower my eyes. I simply held the microphone at my side and watched the guards approach. I could feel the collective anxiety of the room spiking. The guests in the front row shrank back in their chairs, anticipating a physical altercation. The lead security guard, a towering man with broad shoulders and a completely unreadable expression, closed the distance. He walked straight toward where Julian and I were standing at the center of the room. My mother Valerie leaned over the VIP table, a cruel, vindictive smile spreading across her tear-stained face. She was ready to watch me be humiliated, ready to see me dragged out like common trash so she could return to her comfortable delusions. But the guard did not reach for me. He did not even break his stride. He and his 5 men walked right past Julian and me, the fine fabric of their dark suits brushing past my emerald silk gown. They moved like we were completely untouchable. The smug satisfaction instantly drained from my father's face. His extended accusatory finger slowly dropped to his side. The triumphant bark died in his throat. He watched in total paralyzing confusion as the 6 massive guards bypassed the floor entirely and marched in perfect unison up the wooden steps of the main stage. "What are you doing?" my father stammered, stepping back from the podium. "I said grab the woman on the floor. Are you deaf? Get down there." The guards did not listen. They did not even acknowledge his orders. Instead, they moved with clinical efficiency to secure the perimeter of the stage. 2 guards flanked my father, boxing him in completely. 2 more moved directly behind Jamal, who was still standing near the VIP table in a drunken, aggressive stupor. The final 2 guards positioned themselves at the top of the stairs, physically blocking the only exit routes from the elevated platform. Jamal puffed out his chest, his arrogance fueled by the heavy scotch he had been consuming all night. He shoved his hand into the chest of the guard standing closest to him. "Do not touch me," Jamal shouted, slurring his words. "Do you know who I am? I am the senior vice president of this company. I will have you all fired. I will make sure you never work in this city again. Step back right now." The guard did not move a single inch. He simply looked down at Jamal with cold, unwavering indifference. Jamal's threat bounced off him like rain against concrete. The entire Golden family was completely surrounded, physically corralled on the very stage they had intended to use as their throne. My mother gasped, pressing both hands over her mouth. Chloe shrank back in her chair, the sequins of her designer gown catching the harsh stage lights as she realized she was trapped. The VIP table, which had been a symbol of their supreme social dominance just 10 minutes ago, was now a brightly lit, inescapable cage. My father looked out at the audience, his eyes wide with panic, before finally locking onto Julian. "What is the meaning of this?" my father demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury. "Who are these men? I demand that you call them off. I am a platinum member of this country club. I know the general manager personally. I will have this entire establishment shut down." Julian took a slow, measured step forward. He did not need a microphone to command the room. His natural authority filled the sprawling ballroom, heavy and absolute. He looked up at my father, his expression completely devoid of mercy. "You can certainly try to call the general manager," Calvin Julian said smoothly, his deep voice carrying a razor-sharp edge. "But you will find that he no longer holds the authority you think he does. He reports to a new corporate office now." Julian adjusted his tailored cuffs, exuding the quiet, terrifying patience of a man who held all the cards. "You see," Julian continued, addressing my father, but ensuring the entire room was listening, "Vanguard Holdings does not just acquire logistics networks. We specialize in aggressive, diversified portfolio expansion. 3 weeks ago, while you were busy trying to hide your massive financial crimes and planning this obscene retirement gala, Vanguard quietly bought out the premier hospitality management group that owns this country club." A collective shockwave rippled through the elite guests. The neurosurgeons and politicians looked at Julian with a new profound sense of awe and terror. Julian smiled, a cold, devastating expression. "We own the building you are standing in, Calvin. We own the catering kitchen, we own the ballroom, and we own the private security firm guarding the doors. These men do not work for you. They have never worked for you. They work for me. And right now, their only directive is to ensure that no one on that stage moves a single muscle until the proper authorities arrive." The checkmate was absolute. It was flawless. My father slumped heavily against the acrylic podium, all the fight draining out of his massive frame. He finally understood the sheer crushing magnitude of his defeat. He was a prisoner in his own kingdom, held captive by the very man he had spent years dismissing as a struggling nobody. Valerie began to weep openly, the sound of her performative sobs echoing awkwardly in the silent room. Chloe buried her face in her hands, her carefully constructed illusion of the wealthy, untouchable beauty entrepreneur completely obliterated. They were trapped on display for all of Atlanta high society to witness their total ruin. I stood beside my husband, feeling a deep, powerful sense of vindication settling into my bones. But my work was not quite finished. I scanned the chaotic, brightly lit stage, counting the family members who had made my life a living nightmare. My father was neutralized. My brother was cornered. My mother and sister were sobbing. But someone was missing. I shifted my gaze past the frozen security guards, my eyes piercing the dim shadows near the back of the VIP platform. There, moving with frantic, desperate stealth, was Sarah. My brother's old money, fiercely arrogant wife was trying to abandon ship. Sarah had slipped off her high heels to move silently. She was clutching the heavy fabric of her couture gown, creeping along the velvet-draped back wall of the stage. She was trying to reach the heavy service door hidden behind the curtains, desperately hoping to slip out into the night and distance herself from the catastrophic, highly public implosion of my family. She thought she could just walk away, insulate herself with her generational wealth, and pretend she had no part in the cruelty and the theft. I was not going to let her escape. I raised the microphone to my lips. "Leaving so soon, Sarah," I called out, my voice slicing sharply through the heavy tension of the ballroom. Sarah froze instantly. She stood caught in the shadows, her pale shoulders rigid. 200 pairs of eyes immediately snapped toward the back of the stage, pinning her in place. One of the security guards stepped smoothly into her path, blocking the service door with his massive frame. She was trapped just like the rest of them. Sarah slowly turned around. Her face was completely devoid of color. The arrogant, condescending woman who had cornered me by the bar just an hour ago, mocking my husband and telling me to know my place, looked like a terrified, trapped animal. "You really thought you could just walk away from this?" I asked, stepping closer to the stage. "You thought you could sit at that table, drink vintage champagne bought with stolen pension funds, and then slip out the back door when the bill came due? You love to brag about your untouchable family estate and your flawless old money pedigree. You love to make sure everyone in this room knows exactly how much better you are than the rest of us." I lifted the wireless presentation remote and clicked the forward button. The massive projection screens behind my family shifted one final time. The complex financial flowchart dissolved, replaced by a series of highly classified banking ledgers and sealed trust fund documents. The numbers glowed bright white against the black background. "I want the entire room to see exactly how Jamal managed to keep his massive corporate deficits hidden for so long," I announced, pointing up at the screens. "He did not just steal from his own warehouse workers. He needed massive liquid collateral to float the margins and keep the federal auditors blind. And he found that collateral right in his own bed." Sarah let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She shook her head frantically, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. "That is right," I said, my voice echoing relentlessly. "Jamal secretly leveraged your untouchable family trust fund, Sarah. He forged the authorization signatures and used your generational wealth as collateral to secure the offshore shell accounts. Every single dollar your family has been hoarding for decades is completely intertwined with a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. Your accounts are not just frozen by the Internal Revenue Service. They are officially seized evidence in a federal felony investigation. You are completely and utterly ruined." Sarah collapsed against the heavy velvet curtains draped along the back wall of the stage. Her legs simply gave out beneath her. The pristine posture she had spent her entire life perfecting shattered in a single instant. She slid down the wall until she hit the marble floor, her expensive couture gown bunching up around her knees. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her total financial annihilation settled into her bones. She had spent her evening mocking Julian and looking down her nose at me, completely unaware that her own husband had secretly mortgaged her family legacy to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal crime. The old money heiress was now entirely destitute. The 200 elite guests in the ballroom remained absolutely silent. The neurosurgeons, the politicians, and the corporate executives were frozen in their seats. They were no longer watching a family dispute. They were witnessing the catastrophic implosion of a criminal enterprise. No one dared to speak. No one reached for their phones. They were terrified that any sudden movement might draw my attention, terrified that I might have uncovered their own hidden financial secrets during my audit. I stood on the stage, the microphone resting easily in my hand. I felt a profound, grounding sense of peace. For decades, my family had wielded their fabricated wealth like a weapon, using it to batter me into submission and make me feel entirely worthless. Now I had stripped them of their only armor. They were completely exposed. Then the silence of the country club was broken by a sound that cut through the thick tension of the ballroom. It started as a faint, distant wail echoing through the quiet streets of downtown Atlanta. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified, growing exponentially louder as it approached the exclusive neighborhood. The unmistakable shriek of multiple police sirens tore through the calm evening air. My father, Calvin, whipped his head toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows lining the east wall of the venue. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated panic. Jamal snapped his head up from where he stood, cornered by Julian's private security team. The heavy, suffocating dread in the room intensified as the sirens reached a deafening pitch right outside the main entrance of the country club. Brilliant, blinding flashes of red and blue light suddenly pierced through the darkness outside. The harsh, strobing police lights reflected violently against the tall glass panes of the ballroom windows, casting frantic, erratic shadows across the elegant dining tables and the towering ice sculptures. The warm, golden glow of the crystal chandeliers was completely overpowered by the aggressive, rhythmic flashing of federal law enforcement vehicles pulling up to the front doors. My mother, Valerie, let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She gripped the edge of the VIP table, her knuckles turning bone white. She looked wildly from the flashing windows to my father, her eyes begging him to fix a situation that was completely beyond his control. But my father could not save her. He could not even save himself. The heavy brass-handled double doors at the back of the ballroom were thrown open with a violent, resounding crash. A team of federal agents marched into the grand foyer. They did not wear tailored tuxedos or couture gowns. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission printed boldly across their backs. They moved with absolute synchronized authority, their heavy boots stepping firmly onto the polished marble floors. The country club management staff, who normally prided themselves on exclusivity and strict guest lists, immediately scrambled out of the way, flattening themselves against the walls. You do not ask for invitations when the federal government arrives with a stack of signed warrants. The lead agent, a tall, sharp-featured man with a silver badge clipped to his belt, scanned the room. His eyes bypassed the terrified socialites and locked directly onto the main stage where my family stood, surrounded by Julian's private security team. The agent gave a swift, silent gesture, and his team fanned out, marching swiftly down the center aisle of the ballroom. The elite guests practically shrank into their chairs as the federal agents passed their tables. The intoxicating illusion of high society invincibility evaporated. They were watching the untouchable logistics patriarch being actively cornered by the United States government. I raised the microphone to my mouth one final time. I needed to ensure that every single person in this room, from the local politicians to my own trembling mother, understood exactly why this was happening. I needed them to know that this was not a petty act of personal revenge. This was a legal mandate. "Please remain seated," I announced, my voice slicing cleanly through the rising panic in the room. "What you are witnessing is a coordinated federal response to a severe financial crime. I want to make this perfectly clear to everyone present. I did not invite these agents here tonight out of malice. I invited them here because the law required me to do so." The federal agents reached the base of the stage, ascending the wooden steps with purposeful, heavy strides. Julian's private security guards seamlessly stepped aside, relinquishing their perimeter to the federal authorities. As a licensed forensic accountant, I continued speaking slowly and deliberately, so every word echoed across the room. I am bound by strict ethical and legal codes. When Vanguard Holdings initiated the due diligence process for this corporate acquisition, I was granted unrestricted access to the internal financial ledgers. The moment I uncovered a $12 million embezzlement scheme funneling employee pension funds into offshore shell accounts, my legal obligations shifted. I looked directly down at my father. Calvin was trembling, his massive frame shrinking as two FBI agents stepped up beside him. "When you uncover a felony of this magnitude during a corporate buyout, you do not just fire the executives involved," I stated, my tone absolutely clinical and unforgiving. "You are legally mandated to report the findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal authorities immediately. Failing to report an embezzlement of a corporate pension fund would make me a complicit accessory to a federal crime. I spent my entire life building my career from the ground up with absolutely zero help from this family. I refuse to let your staggering greed destroy my professional license or my freedom." I handed the unredacted audit over to the authorities 3 weeks ago. The room was dead silent save for the static crackle of a federal agent's radio. The realization washed over the crowd. I had not just caught my father and brother stealing. I had methodically built an airtight federal case against them, handed the prosecution the murder weapon, and then sat quietly in the back of the room while they threw a party to celebrate their crimes. Jamal let out a pathetic whimpering sound. The golden child, the arrogant executive who had spent the entire evening bragging about his impending wealth and insulting my husband, began to physically back away. He bumped hard against the VIP table, his eyes wide with genuine terror as a federal agent grabbed his arm. "Let go of me," Jamal cried out, his voice cracking like a frightened child. "You do not understand. My dad told me to do it. He told me how to route the money. I did not know it was illegal. I just signed the transfer forms he gave me. He was selling our father out before the handcuffs were even out of the agent's pouch. There was no family loyalty. There was no unbreakable bond. The moment the consequences arrived, the golden children turned into desperate cowards. Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The federal agent ordered, his voice flat and completely devoid of sympathy. Jamal sobbed a loud, ugly sound that echoed over the microphone system. He turned around, shaking violently. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely onto my brother's wrists cut through the ballroom. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The agent grabbed Jamal by the shoulder, spinning him around to face the crowd as he began to loudly recite his Miranda rights. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent declared, reading from a small card. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Two more agents grabbed my father. Calvin did not fight them. He did not yell or threaten to destroy me anymore. The towering, intimidating patriarch was completely gone. He let the agents pull his arms behind his back, his head bowing down toward his chest, in total paralyzing defeat. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, locking him into a reality he could no longer manipulate or control. As the agents began to recite the Miranda rights to my father, a piercing, hysterical scream shattered the remaining tension in the room. My mother Valerie could no longer hold on to her fractured reality. The woman who had spent decades meticulously crafting an image of flawless, untouchable superiority watched her husband and her golden son being bound in federal chains. She watched her entire social empire disintegrate under the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers. Valerie collapsed. She fell hard to her knees right there on the elevated VIP platform, her expensive heavy silk couture gown pooled awkwardly around her on the floor. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, sobbing with a frantic, breathless hysteria that shook her entire body. Her perfect makeup ran in dark streaks down her face. She was wailing loudly, mourning the death of her prestige, the loss of her stolen wealth, and the absolute ruin of the only life she ever cared about. My mother remained on her knees in the center of the elevated platform, her heavy silk couture gown soaking up the spilled champagne, pooling on the marble floor. The flawless, untouchable society matriarch had completely vanished. Her elaborate updo was unraveling strands of hair sticking to her tear-soaked face. She watched the federal agents secure the handcuffs on her husband and her golden son, and the absolute reality of her total financial annihilation finally shattered her mind. She turned her head and looked up at me. For my entire life, her eyes had only ever held contempt, disappointment, or sheer embarrassment when she looked in my direction. Now her eyes held something entirely different. They held a frantic, crawling desperation. She pulled herself forward, dragging her knees across the hard floor, ignoring the ruined fabric of her designer dress. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, desperately trying to grab the hem of my emerald gown. I took a deliberate, measured step backward, refusing to let her touch me. "Maya, please," my mother choked out her voice. A shrill, breathless whine that echoed over the heavy footsteps of the federal agents. "You have to tell them to stop. You have to fix this. You are my daughter. My brilliant, beautiful daughter. Please, Maya, you are so smart. Just tell the agents it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them it was a corporate oversight. You can make this go away. They are taking your father. They are taking everything." I looked down at the woman pleading at my feet. This was the same woman who had openly mocked my appearance just a few hours ago. The same woman who had spent 35 years actively burying my self-esteem so she could elevate my siblings. I searched my heart for a single ounce of sympathy, for any lingering trace of familial loyalty or daughterly obligation. I found absolutely nothing. My chest was entirely hollow of grief. I felt a cold, surgical detachment. "You do not get to call me brilliant now that your stolen empire is burning," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, unwavering calm. "You do not get to claim me as your beautiful daughter, only when you need me to shield you from federal prison. You made your choice decades ago, Mom. You chose the illusion. Now you get to live with the reality." I reached into my sleek clutch purse. My fingers bypassed my phone and found the heavy cardstock invoice my father had shoved into my chest earlier that evening. I pulled out the bill for the $4,500 floral arrangements. I held the thick paper out over the edge of the stage, right above my mother's reaching hands. I let it slip from between my fingers. The invoice fluttered gently through the chilled air of the ballroom, drifting down until it landed squarely at her knees, resting against the ruined silk of her gown. I think you are going to need this more than me, I told her, holding her terrified gaze. You should probably start liquidating your diamond necklaces tonight. Federal defense attorneys require massive retainers paid entirely up front. A sharp, hysterical shriek erupted from the VIP table, pulling my attention away from my mother. Chloe had been backed into a corner by a female agent from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The agent was calmly reciting a list of shell companies and offshore routing numbers, asking Chloe to confirm her status as the primary registrant of the Luxury Haircare Limited Liability Company. The beloved golden child, the supposed visionary entrepreneur who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to get ahead, completely lost her mind. The sheer terror of facing federal money laundering charges stripped away every single ounce of her family loyalty. She shoved her chair backward, pointing frantically across the stage at my father, who was currently being patted down for weapons. I had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, Chloe screamed, her voice cracking in pure, unadulterated panic. I did not know the money was stolen. My dad set up all the accounts. My mom told me exactly what documents to sign. They used my name to hide their own cash. I am a victim here. I am completely innocent. Arrest them. Take them. Do not touch me. My father slowly turned his head, looking at Chloe with an expression of profound, soul-crushing shock. He had sacrificed his entire career, his freedom, and his moral compass to fund her lavish lifestyle, and she had thrown him to the federal wolves without a single second of hesitation. She was selling him out to save her own skin, proving once and for all that the Golden Children possessed absolutely zero loyalty to anything other than themselves. On the other side of the stage, the fallout was equally catastrophic. Jamal was being led away by two federal agents. His head was bowed, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. The arrogant executive swagger had been completely erased. As the agents escorted him toward the service elevator to avoid the local news cameras swarming the front entrance, their path took them directly past the heavy velvet curtains where Sarah was still sitting on the floor. Sarah slowly pushed herself up to her feet. Her pale face was streaked with running mascara. The haughty old money heiress looked entirely hollowed out. Jamal stopped walking for a fraction of a second. He looked at his wife, his eyes pleading for some shred of comfort or support. He opened his mouth, whispering her name. Sarah's face twisted into a mask of absolute visceral revulsion. She did not offer him a comforting word. She did not promise to call a lawyer. She reached down and grabbed her left hand. With a violent, aggressive yank, she ripped her massive diamond engagement ring and her platinum wedding band right off her finger. She threw the heavy rings with all her might. The diamonds struck Jamal hard right in the center of his chest before clattering sharply against the marble floor. "You are a completely bankrupt, pathetic fraud," Sarah spat, her voice vibrating with venom and raw hatred. "You destroyed my family. You destroyed my entire legacy. Do not ever look at me again. Do not ever speak my name again. My lawyers will serve you with divorce papers in federal prison." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, a fresh wave of tears leaking down his face, as the agents firmly grabbed his arms and shoved him through the exit doors. He was gone. My father was gone. My sister was desperately trying to negotiate an immunity deal with the agent standing over her, and my mother was still weeping on the floor next to an unpaid floral invoice. The total dismantling of my toxic family was complete. The fraudulent dynasty had been mathematically and legally eradicated. I felt a warm, strong hand rest gently against the center of my lower back. Julian stepped up close beside me. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply stood there as my unbreakable anchor, exuding the quiet, terrifying power that had orchestrated this entire reckoning. "Are you ready to go home?" Maya Julian asked softly, his voice a soothing contrast to the absolute chaos echoing around us. I looked at the shattered remains of the people who had tried to break my spirit for 35 years. I felt no lingering anger. I felt no sadness. I just felt incredibly wonderfully light. "Yes," I replied, turning my back on the stage. "I am completely finished here." We walked together down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The 200 elite guests, the socialites, the politicians, and the executives who had previously ignored my existence immediately parted like the Red Sea. They scrambled out of our way, pulling their chairs back and pressing themselves against the tables to ensure we had a wide, clear path. No one dared to make eye contact with Julian. No one dared to speak a single word to me. We walked through the room with the unquestioned authority of royalty, leaving a conquered battlefield. We pushed through the heavy brass double doors and entered the grand foyer. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside continued to strobe through the tall glass windows, casting long, erratic shadows across the lobby floor. The valet staff had already pulled our private Blacktown car up to the front curb, leaving the doors open and waiting for our departure. We walked briskly toward the main exit, ready to leave the country club and the toxic wreckage of my past behind forever. But as we neared the final set of glass doors, a tall, imposing figure stepped out from the shadows of the coat-check corridor. The man moved with deliberate speed, placing himself directly in our path and physically blocking our exit. Julian instantly tensed, shifting his weight forward to shield me, but the man raised both of his hands in a gesture of peace. It was the outgoing chairman of the board. He was my father's former boss, the man who held the highest executive authority in the logistics corporation before Julian's private equity firm had executed the buyout. He was a shrewd, sharp-eyed veteran of the corporate world, and he was looking directly at me with an expression of intense, burning calculation. The outgoing chairman of the board was a tall, formidable man named Harrison. He had spent 40 years building his reputation in the corporate logistics sector, and he possessed the kind of sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not look angry as he stood in front of the glass exit doors blocking our path out of the country club. He did not look intimidated by the flashing police lights reflecting off the marble floor or the chaotic sounds of federal agents securing the building behind us. Harrison looked directly at me. He bypassed Julian entirely. His gaze locked onto my face with an expression of profound, unfiltered respect. He slowly reached out and extended his right hand toward me. "I knew your father was hiding toxic assets in his division," Harrison said, his voice a low, steady gravel that cut through the ambient noise of the lobby. "I suspected the corporate ledgers were being manipulated for months, but I could never break through the firewall he built around the accounting department. I expected Vanguard Holdings to clean house during this buyout. I simply never expected the executioner to be Calvin's own daughter." I looked at his outstretched hand for a brief moment before stepping forward and meeting his grip. My handshake was firm and entirely unwavering. "I am a forensic accountant, Harrison," I replied, maintaining direct eye contact. "I do not deal in family loyalty. I deal in mathematics. And the mathematics dictated that your chief financial officer was a liability who needed to be permanently neutralized." Harrison offered a short, gruff laugh, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. He released my hand and took a step back, crossing his arms over his tailored suit. "The logistics network is currently in a state of absolute freefall," Harrison stated, dropping all pleasantries and shifting directly into business. "The board of directors is completely paralyzed by the spectacle that just occurred in that ballroom. We have thousands of warehouse workers, drivers, and administrative staff who are going to wake up tomorrow morning terrified that their pensions have evaporated and their jobs are gone. Julian has the controlling shares, but Vanguard Holdings needs someone on the inside who understands the intricate operational anatomy of this specific corporation." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. "I am stepping down as chairman, but I still retain the power to appoint my successor to the board," Harrison continued. "I do not want some generic corporate placeholder. I want the woman who just dismantled a $12 million federal embezzlement ring without breaking a sweat. I want you, Maya. I am offering you a permanent controlling seat on the board of directors. I want you to step in, stabilize the workforce, and help Vanguard completely eradicate the toxic culture your father left behind." Julian stood silently beside me, his presence a warm, immovable pillar of support. He did not speak for me. He did not interject. He knew exactly what I was capable of, and he was simply waiting for me to claim my crown. I looked at Harrison. I thought about the thousands of innocent employees whose futures had been carelessly gambled away to fund my sister's fake luxury lifestyle and my mother's country club memberships. I thought about the power it would take to ensure no one in that company ever suffered under that kind of arrogant, unchecked greed again. "I will take the seat," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the vast lobby. "But I do not just want a seat at the table. I want full operational oversight of the restructuring process. My accounting firm will merge with Vanguard Holdings to handle the internal audits, and I require absolute transparency from the remaining executives. Anyone who tries to hide a single cent from me will be handed over to the federal authorities before lunch." Harrison smiled a genuine, deeply satisfied smile. He nodded once, a gesture of total agreement. "I would expect nothing less," he said. "Welcome to the board, Maya." Harrison stepped aside, clearing our path to the exit. Julian pushed open the heavy glass doors, and we walked out into the cool, humid Atlanta night. The flashing lights of the police cruisers illuminated our path to the waiting black town car. I did not look back at the country club. I did not look back at the shattered illusion of my family. I simply got into the car, took my husband's hand, and rode away to build my own empire. 6 months passed with the rapid, unstoppable force of a hurricane. The federal justice system does not move quickly, but when it possesses a flawless $12 million forensic audit wrapped in a neat bow, it moves with devastating efficiency. The trial was a highly publicized media spectacle, but it was over almost before it began. My father Calvin and my older brother Jamal did not even attempt to fight the charges in court. Faced with thousands of pages of irrefutable digital evidence, they took desperate plea deals. Today, the men who once wore custom tuxedos and bragged about their untouchable business intellect are wearing identical orange jumpsuits. They are currently serving lengthy federal sentences in a penitentiary located hundreds of miles away from the glittering Atlanta skyline they used to claim as their own. Sarah, my brother's old money wife, filed for a highly contested divorce the morning after the retirement gala. But her legal maneuvering could not save her. Because Jamal had secretly used her family's generational trust fund as collateral for his massive corporate deficits, the federal government seized everything. The Hamptons beach house was auctioned off. The domestic bank accounts were frozen permanently. Sarah lost her pristine social standing, her diamond tennis bracelets, and her unearned arrogance. She was forced to move in with distant relatives in the Midwest, entirely erased from the elite circles she once used to terrorize me. My younger sister Chloe learned the harsh reality of the free market the hard way. Without our father constantly funneling stolen pension funds into her accounts, her fraudulent luxury hair care line collapsed overnight. The Securities and Exchange Commission seized her cars, her designer wardrobe, and every single asset registered to her LLC to pay back the defrauded employees. The golden child, the supposed visionary entrepreneur, is now working a minimum wage retail job at a discount outlet mall on the outskirts of the city. She spends her days ringing up cosmetics for the exact same people she used to treat like absolute garbage. And my mother, Valerie. The woman who spent 35 years telling me I was a budget-friendly disappointment who did not belong in high society. Valerie's entire existence was completely dependent on the wealth and prestige of her husband. When the federal authorities seized my father's accounts and the country club permanently revoked her membership, her superficial friends abandoned her immediately. Socialites do not associate with the wives of convicted felons. Valerie was forced to move out of her sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. She now lives alone in a cramped, drafty one-bedroom apartment. She spends her days sitting on a cheap sofa surrounded by peeling wallpaper, clutching a counterfeit designer handbag. Her phone never rings. No one invites her to galas anymore. She is completely, utterly invisible. I, on the other hand, have never been more visible in my entire life. I am sitting behind a massive custom-built glass desk in my lavish corner office. The floor-to-ceiling windows offer a breathtaking panoramic view of the sun-drenched Atlanta skyline. The morning light spills across the polished hardwood floors, warming the quiet, powerful space I now command. I successfully merged my forensic accounting firm with Vanguard Holdings, creating an unstoppable corporate syndicate. I sit on the board of directors for the newly restructured logistics company, and under my strict financial oversight, the employee pension fund has been completely restored and protected. I walk into boardrooms filled with powerful executives, and when I speak, the entire room goes dead silent to listen. Julian walks into my office carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He looks just as devastatingly handsome as he did on the night we burned my family's empire to the ground. He sets a cup down on my desk, leaning over to press a soft, lingering kiss to my temple. We built this together brick by brick entirely in the shadows until it was time to step into the light. Looking out over the city, I reflect on the profound life-altering truth I discovered on this journey. For 35 years, I exhausted myself, trying to earn the love and respect of a family that was fundamentally incapable of giving it. I let them shrink me. I let them convince me that I was a scapegoat who had to beg for a seat at their glamorous toxic table. But it was a rigged game from the very start. You cannot win the respect of people who require your failure to fuel their own ego. True power does not come from waiting for an invitation to a table where you are secretly despised. True power comes from gathering your own resources, sharpening your own mind, and building your own table from scratch. The greatest lesson from Maya's story is that real success does not always need to announce itself. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Maya's family judged her by appearances, treated her silence as weakness, and assumed that her quiet life meant she had accomplished nothing. They were so focused on displaying wealth, status, and influence that they could not recognize genuine intelligence, discipline, or character when those qualities stood directly in front of them. For years, Maya's parents and siblings created a false definition of success. To them, success meant expensive clothing, important titles, luxury events, powerful friends, and public admiration. Calvin presented himself as a respected corporate leader. Valerie acted like the perfect society matriarch. Jamal claimed to be a brilliant executive while Chloe was praised as a visionary entrepreneur. Sarah used her family's supposed generational wealth to look down on others. Together, they created an impressive image, but behind that image was dishonesty. Calvin and Jamal had stolen millions of dollars from the company's employee pension fund. Chloe's successful beauty business was only a shell used to hide stolen money. The family's luxury lifestyle was not built through talent sacrifice or honest work. It was funded by the retirement savings of hardworking employees who trusted the company to protect their futures. This contrast teaches us an important truth: appearance is not the same as reality. A person may wear an expensive suit and still be deeply insecure. Someone may hold an impressive title and still be incompetent. A family may look perfect in photographs while being cruel and divided behind closed doors. A business may appear successful while collapsing under fraud and debt. On the other hand, someone living quietly may be building something powerful, meaningful, and lasting. Maya did not need to prove herself through constant displays of wealth. She knew who she was. She was a highly skilled forensic accountant and a silent partner in a successful private equity firm. She and Julian had built their company from the ground up through discipline, intelligence, and years of difficult work. Their success was genuine because it was supported by knowledge, integrity, and results. Maya's family could not see this because they had already decided who she was. They needed Maya to remain the family disappointment. Her supposed failure helped them feel more successful. By criticizing her clothes, her hair, her career, and her husband, they protected themselves from confronting their own weaknesses. If Maya was poor, unimpressive, and unsuccessful, then Calvin could continue pretending he was a great leader. Jamal could believe he was a gifted executive. Chloe could call herself a visionary. Valerie could maintain the image of a flawless family. Maya's existence threatened their illusion. This teaches us that some people do not misunderstand us accidentally. They misunderstand us because the false version of us serves their emotional needs. They may need us to be weak so they can feel strong. They may need us to fail so they can avoid examining their own failures. They may continue treating us according to an old identity because accepting our growth would force them to admit they were wrong. In situations like this, endlessly explaining ourselves may not help. Maya could have told her family that she was successful. She could have shown them her financial records, her company documents, or photographs of her real life. But they probably would have found another reason to diminish her. People who are committed to disrespecting us are rarely changed by more evidence. They do not lack information. They lack the willingness to see us honestly. Maya chose a different path. She stopped begging for recognition. That is another major lesson from the story. Freedom begins when we stop allowing other people's opinions to determine our value. Maya's parents had spent years trying to make her feel small. They wanted her to apologize for her natural hair, her clothing, her personality, her choices, and even her presence. At the gala, Calvin attempted to publicly humiliate her in front of 200 guests. He believed that if enough powerful people watched him reject her, she would finally accept his version of herself. But Maya did not collapse. She stood up calmly. She did not cry, shout, or beg him to reconsider. She refused to give him the emotional reaction he wanted. Her composure was not passivity, it was control. There is great power in emotional discipline. This does not mean suppressing every feeling or pretending that cruelty does not hurt. It means refusing to allow anger, fear, or humiliation to control our next decision. Maya felt the pain of her father's rejection, but she did not let that pain destroy her strategy. Many people lose their advantage because they react too quickly. They respond to insults immediately, reveal their plans, send angry messages, or make emotional decisions they later regret. Maya understood that reacting is not always the same as responding. A reaction is often automatic. A response is chosen. She chose timing over impulse. Maya had already gathered the financial evidence. Julian's company had already secured controlling ownership. The acquisition documents were complete. She knew the truth would be more powerful than any argument she could have made during cocktail hour. Instead of fighting with her family over every insult, she allowed them to continue exposing their arrogance in front of witnesses. Her silence gave them room to reveal themselves. Calvin publicly insulted his daughter. Jamal bragged about achievements he had not earned. Sarah mocked Julian without knowing his identity. Chloe demanded that Maya surrender her seat. Valerie defended cruelty in the name of family status. Every one of them contributed to their own humiliation. This illustrates another lesson: arrogant people often create the conditions of their own downfall. Maya did not invent the crimes. She did not falsify the records or manufacture the pension theft. She simply uncovered what Calvin and Jamal had already done. Their destruction came from their own choices. There is a difference between revenge and accountability. Revenge seeks suffering for its own sake. Accountability allows people to experience the natural consequences of their actions. Maya did not destroy an innocent family because she was angry. She exposed fraud that harmed hundreds of employees. The pension money did not belong to Calvin, Jamal, or Chloe. It belonged to workers who had spent years earning their retirement security. By exposing the theft, Maya was protecting people who might otherwise have lost everything. This part of the story reminds us that silence can become dangerous when it protects wrongdoing. There are moments when walking away is wise. There are also moments when evidence must be presented, boundaries must be enforced, and harmful behavior must be stopped. Maya did not confront her family with rumors. She confronted them with facts. She had transaction records, shell company documents, false invoices, account histories, and a complete financial trail. Her evidence was stronger than their reputation. Calvin had powerful friends and an impressive public image, but neither could erase the numbers. Truth supported by evidence is difficult to defeat. This lesson applies far beyond corporate fraud. In personal conflicts, workplaces, families, and legal disputes, people sometimes rely too heavily on emotional arguments. They say everyone knows I am a good person, or people will believe me because of my position. But reputation is not proof. Confidence is not proof. Anger is not proof. Careful documentation can protect us. Save important messages. Read contracts before signing them. Keep records of financial agreements. Document serious workplace problems. Ask for important instructions in writing. Do not assume that people will remember events fairly when conflict begins. Maya's professional discipline protected not only her career, but also the employees whose money had been stolen. The story also offers a powerful lesson about partnership. Julian supported Maya without taking away her voice. He defended her when her family attacked her, but he did not present himself as her rescuer. Although he had the authority to announce the acquisition and remove Calvin and Jamal from their positions, he publicly acknowledged Maya's contribution and gave her the microphone. A healthy partner does not need to dominate every situation. A healthy partner recognizes our strength and helps create space for it. Julian knew that Maya was not helpless. He trusted her judgment, respected her expertise, and stood beside her. Their relationship was built on cooperation rather than control. They had created Vanguard Holdings together, combining his skill in acquisitions with her ability in forensic accounting. Their success was not based only on money, it was based on trust. This stands in direct contrast to Maya's family. Calvin used authority to control, Valerie used shame to control, Chloe used entitlement, Jamal used status, Sarah used class and racial superiority. Each relationship within the family depended on hierarchy. Someone had to be above, and someone else had to be beneath. Maya and Julian built something different. They were powerful together because neither needed the other to become smaller. The story also teaches us that being related to someone does not give that person unlimited permission to disrespect us. Calvin repeatedly used the word family while behaving in ways that were cruel, manipulative, and dishonest. He demanded loyalty, but offered none. He expected Maya to contribute financially to the gala while excluding her from the family table. He threatened to remove her from his will, believing that money would force her into obedience. But family without respect becomes a weapon. Healthy family relationships require care, honesty, accountability, and boundaries. Shared blood does not excuse humiliation. A parent's title does not make every action acceptable. A sibling's needs do not automatically come before our dignity. Love should not require us to tolerate repeated emotional abuse. Setting boundaries does not make someone disloyal. Sometimes boundaries are the only way to stop unhealthy patterns. Maya did not allow her father's public rejection to define her. She did not let her mother's criticism determine how she wore her hair. She did not give up her seat for Chloe. She did not allow Sarah to insult Julian without consequences. Each boundary communicated the same message: you do not control me anymore. The final lesson is that long-term character matters more than short-term applause. At the beginning of the gala, Calvin received a standing ovation. Guests admired him. Cameras photographed him. His family occupied the VIP table. He looked powerful, but applause could not protect him from the truth. Maya sat near the kitchen doors, almost invisible. Yet she possessed the expertise, evidence, and integrity that would determine the future of the company. Her location in the ballroom did not reflect her actual value. Life often works this way. The people receiving the most attention are not always the people creating the greatest impact. Recognition may arrive late. Justice may take time. Honest work may remain invisible for years. But reality eventually demands to be acknowledged. Maya's victory was not created on the night of the gala. It was created during the years when she studied, worked, built her company, developed her expertise, and maintained her integrity despite her family's disrespect. The gala was only the moment when everyone else finally saw what had already been true. That may be the most encouraging lesson of all. You do not need everyone to recognize your progress while you are making it. You do not need permission from people who benefit from underestimating you. You do not have to reveal every plan, announce every achievement, or respond to every insult. Keep building. Protect your character. Learn valuable skills. Choose trustworthy partners. Document the truth. Set firm boundaries. Let your work become stronger than the false stories told about you. People may place you at the smallest table in the darkest corner of the room. They may laugh at your clothes, question your choices, and dismiss the person standing beside you. But their seating arrangement does not determine your worth. Their applause does not determine your success. Their rejection does not erase your future. Sometimes the person they order to leave is the person who quietly holds the keys to the entire building. If Maya's journey reminded you that quiet strength can outlast cruelty, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own lesson about choosing dignity over approval in the comments.